Hello and welcome back to my Silent Hill review marathon, where today you join me for the second part where we're taking a look at the second game released in the series with Silent Hill 2 for the PS2. A lot of people say that this is one of the greatest horror games ever made, but looking at it today and playing it for the first time ever, does it still hold up without looking at it through rose-tinted glasses? Well, let's pop it in and find out. Silent Hill 2 is a game with a massive amount of acclaim. It's almost impossible to go into this having no prior knowledge of what it's about, because at this point it's been talked about to such an extent that anyone with even a small amount of knowledge of games has probably at least heard of it. Having said that though, I personally have only ever played the opening section and have mostly managed to avoid any major spoilers about the details of the plot and even the areas you visit in the game. So I'm going into this with as little insight into the game as it's possible to do so with. Rather than being a standard direct sequel to the first game which continues the story of Harry Mason, Silent Hill 2 actually stars a completely new main character, and the events of the game have nothing to do with the first game either. I actually like this because it means that each game is a self-contained story with a definitive ending, and it allows each game to become a character study of a brand new person. It sort of sets the Silent Hill series up as an anthology series, which is tied together only by the setting, which allows the developers to have a lot of creative freedom. Silent Hill 2 opens with James Sunderland having received a letter from his wife Mary, telling him to meet her in their special place within the town of Silent Hill, where they went on holiday at some point in the past and shared happy memories in. That all sounds nice, but the twist of course is that James's wife died 3 years ago, making it impossible that the note was actually from her. Despite this, because James is desperate and his life has fallen apart since Mary died, he decides to go back to Silent Hill and find out what's going on. The only issue is that he has no idea what Mary is referring to by the special place, so he goes on a journey around the town to visit all of the places that the shared memories in. As we know from the first game though, Silent Hill is no longer just any ordinary town, and instead it's filled with demonic creatures that want nothing more than to rip you into tiny little pieces. What I like about the plot in this game over the first one is that the story that develops here is very personal to James, and the game becomes a dive into his mind and subconscious as we uncover the reason he was called to the town. The first game actually had very little to do with the character that we were playing as, and he was more so just there by coincidence, while the main story concerned the supporting characters around him. I definitely prefer the style that the second game is going for, and it makes for a much more interesting experience. Before we get into the actual game here, I want to point out something very interesting, which is that instead of having a standard difficulty setting for the whole game, Silent Hill 2 actually has much more in-depth customizability in this area by offering a separate difficulty level for the action and for the riddles. The action difficulty alters how much damage the enemies do, how quickly they move, and how much ammo you'll be finding, while the riddle difficulty drastically alters the puzzles in the game. While I played the game on the normal setting in both of these, I looked at some of the differences in terms of the puzzle difficulty, and yeah, it actually makes a pretty big difference. So if you're in the mood for some brain teasing, you can get that here, but if you're more in the mood for scrounging around and playing it as more of a survival game, you could opt to set the puzzle difficulty to easy and the combat to hard. This ends up making the game quite accessible for anyone, no matter what their skill level is and no matter what sort of game they're looking to play. But anyway, we start the game and we're in control of James within the foggy town of Silent Hill. But what are we actually doing? Well, Silent Hill 2 is actually extremely similar to the first game in terms of its structure and its gameplay. You go from the open town of Silent Hill to more enclosed sections which could be considered the proper levels in the game, all while completing puzzles, exploring for key items required to progress, and entering combat with all of the scary creatures. Typical survival horror stuff, right? So what's different about Silent Hill 2 compared to the first game? Well, firstly, straight from the off, the most immediate improvement is that the graphics are much higher quality. Silent Hill 1 was a PS1 game of course, and the second game is a PS2 game, so this graphical difference is probably obvious. But it's still worth bringing up because the jump here is so significant. While the first game looked kinda blocky and lacked detail in certain areas, like for example the characters' faces, Silent Hill 2 looks far more up to a modern standard of quality. If it had ever received a HD remaster, it could have even have passed for a PS3 game, and that would have been the most definitive version of the game by far. Oh, wait. Maybe forget that and stick with the PS2 version. Speaking of versions of the game, there's actually quite a few different releases of this game you can play, and they all vary in quality fairly significantly. So the version I'm playing is the PS2 Director's Cut, which is a more expanded version of the original release, which features a sub-scenario, additional endings, and improved graphics and lighting effects. This version has loads of different names depending on where you're from, with it being called Director's Cut in Europe, Saigo no Uta in Japan, and for some reason the Xbox version in Europe is called Inner Fears. While over in America, this expanded version doesn't have a subtitle and just took the form of the Greatest Hits version instead. Then the second main version of the game is the PC version, which is based on the Director's Cut but has several other improvements like a movie gallery, allowing you to swap weapons on the fly, and more. But at the same time, this PC release also butchers elements of the game, having compressed audio and removing fog effects. So avoid this version unless you're willing to mod it. Then there's the original version of the game which was released on PS2, but this is simply an inferior version of the Director's Cut due to it not having the bonuses from that later release. So I would opt to avoid this one too. Then finally, we have the PS3 and Xbox 360 remasters, which like I've already implied, are really botched versions of the game. Yet again having removed fog effects, but on top of that it also has audio issues and ugly FMV sequences which have been zoomed in to fill a widescreen TV, and way more on top of that. So avoid this one at all costs as it's probably the single worst version of the game. Even the Xbox version of the Director's Cut is notorious for having some issues which are primarily audio related, so the bottom line is that the version you want to be playing is the Director's Cut of the PS2 release. It's pretty much the best way of experiencing the game in every single area. Whew, that was a lot to get through, but now I've done with that massive info dump, let's get back to the actual review. Remember the start of Silent Hill 1 and how it leaves such a massive first impression and sets up the tone for the rest of the game with its amazing introduction sequence? Silent Hill 2 goes for a very similar thing, only I would argue it isn't quite as impactful this time around. You're trying to find your way into the town by running down a back road, and you eventually find your way into the outskirts of town and come across a tunnel which you warily enter after hearing the sound of a radio inside. James is then attacked by a freaky monster which not only has been deformed and looks all fleshy and bloody, but it's also had its arms folded within its own body like a straitjacket made of skin. James does what any normal person would do and bashes it to death using a plank of wood, and then goes on with his day. It's a good opening, don't get me wrong, but it lacks the build-up that the first game had with its rising tension built through the industrial soundtrack, the strange darkness forcing you to brighten your way with a lighter, and of course the crazy dynamic camera angles. Plus, I just think the fact that this is the second game and we sort of already know what to expect makes it difficult for this game to beat the first one here. But hey, all that being said, it's still pretty good, and I do think the monster design here in Silent Hill 2 is much better than the first games. This freaky skin monster is far, far scarier than the strange little demon things toddling after you in the first game, for example. The area of Silent Hill you'll be exploring this time around is different too. Rather than running around the area of town to the north of Toluca Lake like we did in the first game, we're instead south of the lake, which has a lot of different environments to go through, but before we talk about those, let's first talk about the open areas you're free to explore, just like in the first game. Unlike in Silent Hill 1, there's only really one main district you explore in Silent Hill 2, and while you would think that this would be a good thing because they could more heavily litter optional buildings to explore and maybe even more side quests to complete, they actually once again severely underutilise these open sections. In fact, an argument could be made that these sections were actually better in the first game, because at least there you had one major side quest and had to find some key items. In Silent Hill 2, there's not a single side quest, there's very few optional buildings to explore, and whenever you need to find a key item, you're pretty much always just straight up told where it is, rather than having to work it out for yourself. There does seem to be more ammo and healing items littered around the place, so it's not like there's zero incentive to roam the streets, but I was kind of expecting more from this aspect of the game. A big positive of these open areas this time around though is that there's no longer flying demons and zombie dogs chasing after you constantly, and rather the enemies in the outdoor areas are all slow and pose very little threat, making it so you can take your time and soak in the atmosphere a bit more. The thing is though, is that because the monsters pose such a small threat, there's not really a lot of point in them being there at all. After a while you just get used to them and you stop paying attention to them, which obviously isn't a good thing when it's supposed to be a scary horror game. It doesn't help how the monsters you see outside are the same ones used in a lot of the indoor areas too, so it kinda completely ruins the sense of mystery of what the monsters will look like, because there's very little variety and they're recycled constantly. Just like with the first game though, the real highlight of Silent Hill 2 is with the indoor sections. This is where the game becomes a lot more intimidating and where it really excels in its three main gameplay styles, these being combat, puzzles, and exploration. So James will eventually reach an apartment building which he has to get through in order to reach a nearby park that he suspects could be the special place that Mary is referring to in a letter. At this point you only have access to a wooden plank as a weapon, and while the combat is fundamentally the same as it was in the first game, it works slightly differently. In the first game you had to hold the X button to do a strong attack and tap it to do a light attack, whereas this time this is a rare example of a game that uses the pressure sensitive face buttons on the PS2 controller. So the harder you press X, the harder James will swing his weapon. For a while I didn't understand this and I was thinking that maybe the wooden plank didn't have a strong attack or something, but then I figured it out and it all made sense. If I'm being completely honest, I probably preferred the way the first game did this because it's just a bit easier to instantly understand, but it works well enough. The thing is though, is that despite me using the melee weapons in Silent Hill 1 a lot, potentially even more so than the guns, I hardly even touched the melee weapons in the second game. In fact, I literally didn't even find the metal pipe, which is supposed to be one of the most iconic weapons of the series, so I'm not entirely sure how I managed to bypass that. The reason for not using the melee weapons much though is that you get the handgun in the apartment building, which is the first main area of the game, and then you get given so much ammo that you never ever are gonna realistically run out. I killed every single enemy I came across in the interior sections of the game, and I still had over 100 shotgun shells left after the end of the game. So yeah, I feel like it's a little bit too generous in this way, and it sort of ruins the survival aspect of the survival horror. Maybe I should have played the game on hard mode or something, but even so, I feel like it's a bit too easy in this way, even for the normal mode. Plus on top of this, you get given way too many healing items, which again, kinda makes you feel like an invincible killing machine, which isn't how you're supposed to feel at all. A thing that Silent Hill 2 does much better than the first game though, is that it's extremely rare that you'll come across a section where two enemies are attacking you at the same time. Even when there are two enemies in the same room, they're positioned in such a way where only one normally notices you at a time, or they're placed behind each other so you can take them out at the same time. The enemies here also move drastically slower than the foes from Silent Hill 1, so overall, the combat here is a lot more manageable. The thing is though, is that I kinda feel like this was maybe an area of the game that needed something more going on. It actually started to feel like the combat was severely underdeveloped towards the end, because every single enemy is defeated in the exact same way. Literally even the boss battles boil down to just shooting them and tanking damage, and it's not very good if I'm being honest. Maybe they could have taken some inspiration from the Metal Gear Solid series and had a system that allowed you to go into a first-person viewpoint to more accurately aim or something. That way certain enemies could have had specific weak points to hit and it would have been a lot more engaging. The combat was fine in the first game because it had a lot more going on than its competition, but with Silent Hill 2 being more modern, I feel like some extra thought should have gone into this. Okay, so let's move on and talk about something that's potentially a little bit more positive, shall we? So, how are the puzzles in this game? Well, I'm happy to report that I didn't have to look up a single thing in this game, and most of the times I got stuck were pretty much my own fault for not paying enough attention. Like there was a bit where this elevator doesn't move because of exceeding a weight capacity, and this literally isn't even a puzzle. You're just supposed to put all of your stuff on a shelf nearby, but I was an idiot and didn't inspect the shelf, and so walked around the entire building again, not knowing what I was supposed to be doing, which took like half an hour. And then I finally went back to the room and inspected the shelf, and then could move on. The actual puzzles featured in the game though are mostly very good, although probably again not quite as good as they were in the first game. A few of the first game's puzzles had me writing stuff down and had moments where suddenly everything clicked and you felt like a genius for working it out, but in Silent Hill 2, most of the puzzles were a bit too easy to really have that effect, and the ones that were harder kinda just felt like I brute forced them. Like for example, there's this bit where there's a cube that you can spin around which makes this room rotate, and the idea is to make a path forward by moving the cube in the right way to make the doors in the room line up. I have no idea how I actually did this, I just spent ages going back and forth moving the cube around a bit, and it worked. Or there's this, where you need to place these metal plates on top of each other, which all have holes in different places, and the idea is to make it so that there's no holes that you can see through. So the picture behind the plates is fully concealed. This one was a bit annoying, and I feel like the user interface could have been made a lot better here and allowed you to drag and drop the plates, but instead you have to go through loads of text before placing and removing plates, and you can't preview what the plate will look like before you place it. It's probably the single worst puzzle in the entire game, to be honest. But anyway, outside of some examples like this, the majority of the other puzzles in the game are good. Like there's this one in the apartment building where you need to move the hands of a clock to the right time by following a riddle in the next room and a diagram on the wall with a list of 3 names, which are all referring to a particular hand of the clock. Or this one where you need to find 3 coins and then you have to place them into 5 different slots in a certain order by following yet another riddle. These are the sorts of puzzles that I really enjoyed, but disappointingly I found that later on this riddle style of puzzle became less common, which is a shame. Another type of puzzle is this style where you need to combine key items to use them in a specific way to get past an obstacle. This isn't used all too often, but a lot of the time it just made me laugh because of how, shall we say, creative James gets with the stuff he finds. Like there's this bit where you find a horseshoe, some wax, and a lighter, and you have to melt the wax onto the horseshoe and place it into a trapdoor to use it as a makeshift handle. But it's kinda just like, I'm pretty sure the wax wouldn't be anywhere near strong enough to lift the weight of the door, right? Then there's this bit where you unlock like 5 locks on a box only to open it and find some strands of hair. So he uses the hair by combining it with a needle and makes a sort of hook to put down a plug hole to get another key item. I mean, this is just ridiculous because why even go to the trouble of unlocking the box to get some strands of hair when he could have just have used his own hair, surely? Plus, who is putting strands of hair in a box that has like 5 locks on it in the first place? It's just absolutely ridiculous on every single level, and it really made me laugh, which probably wasn't what the game was intending to do. Speaking of this section of the game though, does anyone else think that this item stuck down a plug hole kinda looks like a severed ear? I can't be the only one who sees that, right? But yeah, these item combining sections are a little bit unnecessary and kinda just ended up making me laugh at how James was using such random combinations to make his way around. It really is a bit ridiculous. So let's talk about the third style of the game, which is the exploration. Some of the later puzzles are kinda less about being an actual puzzle and more so about finding a key item and using it in a certain way. Like here, where you come across a photo with a combination to a suitcase on it, but it's been scribbled on with marker pen. So you go exploring and you find some thinner, and then you go back and use it on the photo to reveal the combination. That's not really a puzzle per se, but it's something that rewards exploration by giving you a key item. Most of the latter half of the game is spent doing this sort of thing as opposed to actual puzzles, which some people might prefer, but I would have maybe liked a few more proper puzzles. Yet again, I feel like the first game mixed these two styles a bit better than in the second game. But the best thing about the exploration quite clearly isn't just finding and using key items. It's all about the atmosphere and the creepy locations you visit. So let's talk about that. Silent Hill 2's environments are very, very good. It doesn't really follow the same structure as Silent Hill 1 in terms of having a distinct normal world and scarier otherworld, but rather it kinda more organically transforms the world into a scarier version of itself at certain times. This makes it far less predictable and therefore more terrifying whenever it does happen, but it also means that it happens less frequently too. But to compensate for the otherworld section of the games being a little bit less frequent, the normal world has been made much scarier, so it sort of balances itself out. Of course, one of the main elements that makes this game scarier than the first is the far better monster designs. We've already talked about the fleshy monsters with skin straitjackets, but we also have these living mannequins which look to have been put together wrong, so they're just a set of two pairs of legs flailing around while screaming, and we also have one of the most iconic creatures to the Silent Hill franchise in the form of the nurses. We already had zombie nurses in Silent Hill 1, but these kinda just looked like normal people and they weren't that scary because of that. In Silent Hill 2 though, they move in a very inhuman way, twitching all over the place and moving in an unpredictable pattern, which makes them far more foreboding. Plus, the fact that the faces seem to consist of just a layer of skin as opposed to an actual face with features is another pretty freaky touch. From the looks of it, these nurses are probably suffering with Silent Hill scary shaky-itis, which yes, I'm still suffering from too. But I popped a couple of tablets earlier and it seems to be keeping it at bay. Although, that was quite a while ago now. Oh no! But of course, I know why you're all here. You want me to talk about the main man himself. Pyramid Head. Easily the most recognisable enemy from any Silent Hill game, and there's a damn good reason for that. He's a man with a massive pyramid on his head. What's not to love? The reason this monstrosity is so scary and beloved though is because he's seen in multiple situations and used in a variety of ways, which keeps him looming over you as this constant threat. First he's seen in the apartments just watching you from behind a gate. Then he's got a mini-boss battle where he runs away at the end of it like a little baby. Later in the game he smashes you off of a hospital roof, which actually made me panic quite a lot because you hear him coming during gameplay before it cuts to the cutscene. So you're thinking at first that you need to run away and hide or something before you quite realise what's happening. And then he keeps tormenting you later in the game as well, but I won't mention that right now because it gets into spoilers. The variety in locations you visit here is pretty great too. There's the apartments, a hospital, because of course there has to be a hospital, the Silent Hill Historical Society, and finally a hotel. Each of which are very distinct and there's lots of different scary moments sprinkled into each of them. Easily, by a massive amount, the best area of the game for completely messing with you is the Historical Society. Having you go down an absolutely huge staircase which literally takes about 40 seconds to run down and feels very out of place and almost like it's impossible to actually exist because of how far you're going. You then jump down several massive holes which seemingly should kill you because they're so deep. You get teleported to some kind of prison with twisted impossible hallways that go into the sky and down as far as the eye can see. You enter a courtyard which is massive and almost completely empty aside from a small area where people were executed by being hung. Then finally you end up in some sort of twisted maze of hallways which seems utterly disconnected from the prison and the Historical Society building that you started in. It's a great section of the game and you can tell the developers were just going absolutely all out with trying to mess with you here. Some of the smaller moments really stick out here too, like this bit where you enter a bathroom and get to a stall at the end and you can knock on it. Now, bear in mind that this is the only part in the game where you can interact with anything in this way, and then after knocking, literally nothing happens. It's the way it gets you to anticipate something and then defies that expectation you have that really gets to you. And what makes this extra interesting is that I watched someone else play this section, and after knocking on the door and walking away, a massive crash happened as if the door had been blasted open behind them. But this didn't happen to me. So it's after watching this that I discovered that the game actually is somewhat randomised with what audio happens in certain locations, meaning that the experience you have with the game is slightly different every time you play it. So even if you're really familiar with the game, you can't truly know what's going to happen. That's just such a brilliant touch for a horror game, and it feels quite ahead of its time. Amazing stuff. As with the first game as well, I want to point out that the sound design here is just straight up impeccable. It's potentially even better than the first game too, in the way it has a more dynamic soundtrack which can change depending on where you stood in any particular room. This can make certain areas of a singular room feel out of place and almost like something isn't right about a certain doorway or something, and it made me feel incredibly uneasy. The place I actually initially consciously noticed this dynamic soundtrack was here in the hospital, where you stand in this particular area and the soundscape changes, and it made me feel like something was skulking around somewhere off screen that I couldn't see. So yeah, the exploration is by far the best thing about the entire game, and I actually think that it's a shame that this wasn't more of a focus over the combat and the puzzles. I really wish that there were more buildings to go into to get more scary moments and potentially more lore about the town too. But what bits of exploring we can partake in here are truly amazing and definitely the highlight of the game. The exploration in Silent Hill 1 was also my favourite part of the game, and that also had its own fair share of scary standout moments, so I wouldn't really say that the second game is outright better than the first game in this area, but there is one major way that Silent Hill 2 has the first game beat hands down, and that's the story. Unlike with Silent Hill 1, I feel like the absolute main driving force of the game this time around is the story. So, this is your spoiler warning. Skip to the time that's currently on the screen if you want to avoid my story summary. Okay? We all good? Then let's crack on with it. So then, after James escapes his encounter with Pyramid Head in the apartments, he reaches the park he was thinking his deceased wife Mary was talking about in a letter. He finds a person called Maria there who looks identical to Mary, only with different clothes and being a lot more extroverted than Mary too. The two team up to look for Mary, and this is where an escort section of the game begins. The general opinion of people seems to be that this section isn't very good because Maria's AI is a bit rubbish and she gets in the way a lot. But to be honest, I didn't actually have too much of an issue with this, and it helped that this section doesn't last very long either. So I don't know. Maybe I just got lucky or something, but I feel like people are being dramatic when they talk about how bad this escort section is. It's perfectly fine from what I experienced. Anyway, the two of them eventually run into two other characters called Eddie and Laura that were actually previously introduced to us in the apartment area of the game. Eddie was seen throwing up in a toilet earlier and just generally was acting a bit weird. Even now, he doesn't really seem to care what's going on and is just sat there eating pizza, even when Laura, who's this bratty little girl, runs away to a nearby hospital. James and Maria go looking for Laura, but Maria becomes tired and rests in a side room while James goes ahead and does everything himself. Geez, it's like he's the main character of the story or something. James eventually finds Laura, but she locks him in a room after he gets angry at her because she tells him that she knew Mary and the two of them spoke recently, which of course is impossible because Mary died 3 years ago. James escapes the room and reunites with Maria, but when they try and escape the hospital, Pyramid Head appears and chases after them, with James managing to reach an elevator just in time, but Maria gets killed as the elevator doors close. James is now alone once again and decides to go to the nearby hotel, which is the second place he thinks Mary could have been referencing in a letter. To get to the hotel though, he needs to take a boat across Toluca Lake, but the only boat is locked behind the Silent Hill Historical Society. As I mentioned before, this is where Silent Hill begins to seriously warp reality, not only plunging James into a prison and a labyrinth where Pyramid Head once again appears, but also we find Maria again, who is inexplicably still alive, and we come across another character called Angela, who we saw earlier being on the brink of committing suicide. This time when we meet her, she's being attacked by a creature who she seems to think is her father, and it's revealed that she seems to be in a dire mental state after her father abused her earlier in her life, while her mother did nothing to help. Angela is also heavily implied to have killed her father too. After this encounter, James and Angela once again part ways, but then we bump into Eddie, who is revealed to not only have killed a dog, but now has also killed several people who he thinks have wronged him in some way. James clearly doesn't know how to react in a crisis like this, and basically calls Eddie nuts, which obviously ends with Eddie attempting to kill him. But with James being the main character of the game, Eddie obviously fails, and this results in James killing Eddie in self-defense. At this point, James's mental state is deteriorating. After all, he's been through quite a lot at this point. But he presses on and eventually finds the hotel where he and his wife stayed years ago. Laura, the little girl from earlier, is once again inexplicably at the hotel as well, and she hands James a letter which explains that Mary knew Laura from the hospital where Mary was being treated for her illness, which eventually led to her death. This makes us question the timeline of events that James has been giving to us for the whole game, and it turns out that he could be an unreliable source of information. And Mary may have died far more recently than what we've been led to believe. James presses on to the room he and Mary stayed at and watches a videotape they left there, which shows that James actually killed Mary while she was suffering with her illness, and the exact reason for this is kinda left ambiguous. It could be that he killed her because he knew that she didn't want to live like that, sort of as a mercy killing. Or it could be that he killed her because he somewhat resented her for ruining his life he had planned with her, or saw her as being as some sort of burden. Either way, regardless of what your interpretation of this scene is, James then tries to escape the hotel, but it's transformed, crumbling around him almost as if it had been caught in a blaze years ago. He finds Maria again after being separated from her earlier, and watches helplessly as she's killed by not one, but 2 Pyramid Heads. As for why there's 2 of them, I suspect that the first Pyramid Head was created by James when he killed Mary, and the second one was created when he killed Eddie. Earlier in the game, the Pyramid Head is said to be an executioner, so this theory seems to make a certain amount of sense. I feel like maybe the Pyramid Heads are a reflection of James's desire to be punished for what he's done. But either way, after James seems to realise that the Pyramid Heads are a physical manifestation of his guilt, he manages to defeat them. He then makes his way up to the roof where once again Maria is found and she transforms into a weird bedridden monster who James fights in the final boss fight. The ending I got was where Mary actually appears after the fight, although at this point this could be James's mind playing tricks on him or yet another illusion Silent Hill has created. But either way she forgives him before dying once again in his arms. James then realises he can't forgive himself for what he did and he drives into Toluca Lake, killing himself to be with Mary in death. Yeah, it's pretty cheery stuff. It's a good job the game ended on a light-hearted note, otherwise I don't know what I would have done. This ending is generally considered to be the canon ending of the game too, as it's the one that's referenced subtly by a lot of things in the game. The title screen, for example, kinda looks like it's underwater, the first fight with Pyramid Head ends with him running into a flooded stairwell, and there's yet another flooding section just as James remembered that he killed Mary in the hotel section. Because the game never received a direct sequel and later games don't reference the events of Silent Hill 2 directly, any of the endings could be considered canon. But I feel like the one I got is probably the closest thing we'll ever get to an official proper ending. So yeah, there's a lot more that goes on throughout the story with side characters, but that's basically the gist of what happens. And yeah, I much prefer the story here than the one in the first game. It's way more personal to James, and there's loads of symbolism which gives clues about his mental state and past, which I love. And most importantly, the town of Silent Hill itself seems to have some sort of otherworldly cosmic power that traps people there who need to atone for something. That's way better than having a crazy cult be behind all of the goings on like in Silent Hill 1, but it does get me wondering how exactly the events of the first game are connected to the second game. Like, if the demon god thing was killed by Harry at the end of the first game, then why is Silent Hill still cursed like this? Maybe the demon had nothing to do with the power of Silent Hill, or maybe Silent Hill 2 is set before, or maybe even during the events of Silent Hill 1. Who knows, but maybe a later game will give us more answers. Either way though, I had a lot of fun going through Silent Hill 2, and after completing it you still technically aren't done because you could go for all of the additional endings, but on top of that, if you've got the director's cut, there's also an additional sub-scenario where you play as Maria just before meeting up with James for the first time. To be honest, this second story is a little bit unnecessary. It's extremely short and it actually features a really annoying section at the start where it's not obvious where to go. And plus the puzzle I mentioned way earlier, where you need to put the metal plates on top of each other to cover a picture, is actually in this second scenario too. So yeah, it's kind of annoying how one of the worst puzzles is featured in this bit of the game, but hey, I guess I would rather it be here than in the main game, because that way you can avoid it if you're only playing the main story. There is some interesting lore here, and there's also a brand new building to explore, but there's not really anything substantial to find here particularly. But hey, it's a nice bit of extra content, and it would have been awesome for fans at the time to have something new to experience in a game that they're so familiar with, so I can't complain too much. I'm putting Silent Hill 2 in... you know what, I'm actually going to put it in 3rd position in my series ranking. I'm probably in a very small minority here, but I genuinely think the first game is better than the second game. There are obviously elements that make Silent Hill 2 better, like the monster designs, the graphics, and definitely the story, but there's also a ton of ways that Silent Hill 1 is better. I found the open areas to be a bit more interesting in the first game, with it having more variety in the different districts you go to, and having at least one side quest. I found the first game to have better and more consistent puzzles, and to be honest, I found the environments to be a bit better in the first game too. It just felt like there was a little bit more variety, with the smaller areas like the mall and the sewers separating the big areas like the school. But I also find it strange how Silent Hill 2 uses a hospital as a main location when Silent Hill 1 already did that. I get that it's relevant to James's story, but it just feels a bit weird exploring what's basically the same level theme as one of the levels from the first game. I also thought that Silent Hill 1 was maybe a little bit more subtle with messing with the environments and stuff, whereas the second game makes these bits a little bit more obvious by either highlighting them in cutscenes or just straight up rubbing them in your face. Which is fine, obviously, and it works, but I just think the first game maybe had a little bit more subtlety in this area, which made it a bit better in my opinion. Something I really didn't like about Silent Hill 2 was how there's so few monster designs, and they're all used quite a lot throughout the game too. They actually really quickly lose their sense of scariness, which is really frustrating because, like I just said, the actual visual design of the monsters is amazing, but it just loses the initial shock value due to the amount we're exposed to them. I would go as far as to say that just like Silent Hill 1, it's actually not a very scary game really. It's more just a creepy game. In fact, I would actually say that Silent Hill 1 is scarier than Silent Hill 2. Fight me. I also think the combat is a bit clunky, which isn't a problem at all for the majority of the game because it does do its job perfectly fine even if it's not a standout part of the game. However, the boss battles are so bad it's ridiculous. I basically had to break the flow of the game every 2 seconds by pausing it to either reload or to heal, which, just like in the first game, you can't do in the gameplay itself. I really feel like you should have been able to have cycled through items, reloaded and healed in the game itself rather than having to enter a menu. The bottom line is kinda just that Silent Hill 2 is very similar to Silent Hill 1. It makes very few changes to the first game, using the same structure, same map system, same control scheme, same combat, but just changing the graphics, some of the places you visit, and the story. There's nothing wrong with that, after all I loved Silent Hill 1, but I did expect a little bit more considering Silent Hill 2's reputation. I feel like the reason you play Silent Hill 2 isn't really for the game itself in a lot of ways, and it's more so to see what happens in the story. But even then, if that's the reason you're playing the game, you could find yourself frustrated because the story unfolds very slowly and it's not until right at the end that you start getting any concrete answers. So yeah, make of that what you will, I suppose. And that's Silent Hill 2. Even though I've done a lot of complaining in this video, I do want to just clarify that I did really enjoy this game. I think in particular the story it presents is just really engaging, and I love all of the symbolism and all of the little interesting tidbits of lore that it scatters throughout its world. I think the presentation of this story is actually one of the main reasons that this game has such a big reputation, rather than the gameplay itself. I think what I would like to see from the third game is some more focus being put on the open explorative sections, as well as making the combat feel a little bit more in depth. Plus, having more variety in enemies wouldn't hurt either. But we'll have to wait until the next part of the Silent Hill marathon to see if it actually does any of those things, because next time we're going to be taking a look at Silent Hill 3, which was also released on the PS2. Meanwhile though, if you enjoyed this video, give it a like, subscribe to see more stuff like this coming soon, and leave a comment down below letting me know how much you hate me for preferring the first game over the second one. And until next time,